The Academy Days, Part 3. The notice appeared on the communal board at 0600, slotted between a maintenance schedule update and a reminder about uniform inspection standards. It was typed in the same flat, administrative font the Academy used for everything, as though the content were no more significant than a shift rotation or a change to the mess hall menu. Novice Wyatt Staples, Additional Assessment. GVK 707D. Simulation Chamber 3, 14 o'clock. Attendance mandatory. Wyatt read it twice. Not because he didn't understand it, but because the designation landed somewhere in his chest and stayed there. GVK 707D. He knew the system. Every novice did. The GVK series were the graded combat simulations, tiered by difficulty and opponent type. The number denoted the scenario. The letter suffix denoted the enemy. And D meant Drazen. The GVK 707 series was the Academy's unofficial graveyard, endurance tests designed to exceed a novice's limits until they broke. The cruelty was elegant in its simplicity. If Wyatt failed quickly, the message was clear. The commoner who thought he could fly couldn't handle a real threat. If he lasted longer than expected, the result would be buried in the same administrative silence that had swallowed every other score that proved inconvenient. And if by some odd chance he beat the simulation, it would be dismissed as a malfunction because GVK 707D was not meant to be beaten. Not by novices, not by most instructors. Certainly not by pilots of commoner stock. Around him, the morning corridor traffic moved in its usual patterns. Commoners heading to the mess hall with their eyes down, nobles heading that same way had their eyes on everyone else. A few commoners followed nobles like loyal pets, praising them with words or actions, hoping to get a crumb of attention and their status reflected on them as a badge of honor. A few novices glanced at the board as they passed. Most didn't stop. One did, a noble from the third-year intake whose name Wyatt had never bothered to learn, and his eyebrows rose a fraction before he moved on, glancing at Wyatt with an expression that sat somewhere between pity and entertainment. Word would spread. It always did. By midday, every novice in the year group would know that the commoner who had killed Beaumont Hale's fighter in 1 minute and 31 seconds was being sent into GVK 707D, and every single one of them would understand exactly what that meant. There was no outcome that served Wyatt. Every result had already been assigned its meaning before he set foot in the chamber. That was the real artistry of it. He turned away from the board and walked to the mess hall. His face was the same mask it always was. His stride was the same measured, unhurried pace that drew no attention and invited no scrutiny. The designation sat heavily in his chest. He'd been 7 years old the day he was introduced to the Drazen in all their grotesque brutality. He buried his feelings deep, and he carried that day the way he carried everything else at this academy. Silently, deeply, and without giving anyone the satisfaction of knowing it was there. One day he'd face the real thing. Not a simulation. Not a test designed by a man who had never seen a Drazen fighter outside of a textbook. The real monsters. And when that day came, he intended to be ready. But that wasn't why Beaumont Hale had chosen this test, and Wyatt knew it. The instructor didn't have access to childhood records. He hadn't chosen GVK 707D because he knew about a 7-year-old boy hiding under a pile of corpses. He had chosen it because it was the hardest test permitted by the Academy, and sending the commoner who had embarrassed him into a simulation designed to be unbeatable by someone of their current skill was the kind of punishment that could be dressed up as a professional assessment. The cruelty was impersonal. That didn't make it less effective. Wyatt collected his tray in the mess hall, sat at the commoner table, and ate his breakfast with the mechanical efficiency of someone fueling a machine. Around him, the usual patterns played out. Nobles laughing too loudly at their own jokes, commoners eating in silence, the invisible architecture of hierarchy expressing itself in seating arrangements and volume levels. Across the hall, Petra Dayton sat 2 seats down from him, eating her own breakfast in the quiet way that left her, for the most part, unnoticed. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. The communal board was visible from the mess hall entrance, and Petra missed nothing. At 14 o'clock, he would walk into Simulation Chamber 3 and face a squadron of Drazen fighters. The simulation would try to kill him. Beaumont Hale would be watching, waiting for the failure that would restore the balance. Every novice in the year group would hear the result before the day was out. Wyatt finished his breakfast, returned his tray, and went to his morning classes. His notes were precise. His answers were correct. His mask did not slip. The simulation chamber sealed behind him with the familiar hiss of pressurized locks, and the world outside ceased to exist. Wyatt settled into the cockpit. The controls were the same as every other simulation he'd run. Standardized Academy layout, responsive but unspectacular. the kind of setup designed to teach doctrine rather than test the limits of what a pilot could actually do. He ran his hands across the instruments with the unhurried confidence of a boy who had spent more time in these chairs than any regular commoner was supposed to, and considerably less than any novice of his ability deserved. The display initialized. Stars first, cold and distant, then the void filled in around them, an open sector of space, no asteroid field this time, no debris to hide behind. Just empty black in every direction, punctuated by the faint glow of a distant nebula on the starboard horizon. And somewhere out there, waiting, a squadron of simulated Drazan fighters. No cover, no terrain to exploit, nowhere to hide. Just Wyatt, a single fighter, and whatever was coming. Beaumont Hale's voice came through the comms, stripped of its usual bored authority and replaced with something closer to anticipation. Novice Staples, the scenario will commence in 10 seconds. You are facing a standard Drazan fighter patrol squadron. Engage and survive as long as you are able. The simulation will terminate upon your destruction or at the Proctor's discretion. Or at the Proctor's discretion. Wyatt filed that phrase away. It was a clause that didn't appear in the standard simulation briefings, and the fact that Beaumont Hale had included it meant the man was leaving himself a door. Interesting. The countdown reached 0. Nothing happened. 3 seconds of silence. 5, 7. Wyatt's eyes swept the display. Empty space in every direction. No contacts. No signatures. No movement. The sensors showed clean returns across all bands, the kind of pristine nothingness that a textbook would describe as an all clear, and that Wyatt's instincts described as a trap. Because that was how the Drazan operated. They didn't announce themselves unless they perceived they had the upper hand. They didn't approach on predictable vectors. They didn't extend the courtesy of letting you know they were there before they killed you. They waited until you believed you were alone, and then you weren't. He cut his engines to minimal output, reducing his thermal signature to the lowest possible level, and began a slow rotation on his axis, expanding his sensor sweep to maximum range. The cockpit was quiet. His breathing was steady. His hands rested on the controls with the loose, ready grip of a pilot who knew that the difference between survival and destruction in the next few seconds would be measured in fractions. There. A flicker on the edge of his sensor range. Port side, low, closing fast. Then another. Starboard high, then 2 more, dead ahead, staggered at different altitudes. The contacts materialized on his display like predators emerging from tall grass. 4 Drazan fighters approaching from 4 different vectors, converging on his position in a pattern that no Academy doctrine had a name for, because no Academy doctrine acknowledged that an enemy might attack from everywhere at once. He frowned slightly, trying to focus on the task at hand. 4 on 1. No cover. Wonderful. This is exactly how I wanted to spend my afternoon. The first Drazan fighter opened fire at a range that the approved doctrine classified as premature, and that Wyatt classified as exactly what I'd do. He was already moving before the shots arrived, rolling hard to starboard and pulling into a tight descending spiral that put the incoming fire above and behind him. The shots passed through the space he'd occupied half a second earlier, close enough that the proximity sensors flickered amber. He didn't return fire. Not yet. 4 targets, 1 coil gun, and limited ammunition meant that every shot had to count, and shooting at a Drazan fighter that was actively maneuvering was a waste of rounds unless you had a clean angle. He didn't have a clean angle. He had 4 hostiles closing from 4 directions, and the only advantage he possessed was that he'd spent the last year teaching himself to think the way they did. The second and third fighters came in simultaneously. A pincer from above and below that would have caught any novice flying a standard evasive pattern in a crossfire with no escape. Wyatt didn't fly a standard evasive pattern. He killed his engines entirely, let his fighter coast on momentum for 2 seconds, an eternity in a dogfight, and then fired a single hard burst from the maneuvering thrusters that slammed him sideways and out of the convergence zone. The 2 Drazan fighters, committed to their attack runs, overshot and crossed each other's firing arcs. One of them clipped the other's shield envelope. Not enough to damage, but enough to force both into a momentary correction. Momentary was all he needed. Wyatt pivoted, lined up the trailing fighter in his reticle during the half-second window its correction created, and fired. 1 burst. The shot struck the Drazan fighter's port thruster housing, and the contact on his display flickered, stuttered, and went red. Kill confirmed. 30 seconds into the engagement. First blood, he thought with satisfaction. 3 to go. At this rate, I might even survive long enough to be punished for it. But the remaining 3 Drazan fighters didn't react the way Principality opponents would. There was no hesitation, no moment of reassessment, no pause to process the loss of a wingman. They adapted instantly. The formation dissolved and reformed into something tighter, more aggressive. The three survivors collapsing inward on his position with a coordinated ferocity that felt less like tactics and more like instinct. Wyatt hauled his fighter into a climbing barrel roll as coil gun rounds stitched the space beneath him. The Drazan were faster than any Principality-designed fighter the Academy had in its simulation library, and their maneuvering capabilities were vicious, turns that would have torn a Seagull class apart at the structural level, acceleration curves that bordered on physically impossible. The simulation wasn't being generous. It was accurate. This was what Drazan fighters actually flew like, and the reason the approved doctrine didn't have answers for them was that it had been written by people who had never survived long enough to study them. Wyatt had studied them. Not in the Academy's sanitized tactical briefings, which treated the Drazan as a theoretical threat to be managed through proper formation discipline, but in the raw engagement data he'd found buried in the Academy's archive during the late hours when commoners were supposed to be sleeping. Available black box recordings from actual encounters. The jerky, fragmentary footage of real pilots fighting real Drazan and mostly dying. He'd watched those recordings dozens of times, cataloging the patterns that the Academy's doctrine refused to acknowledge. The way Drazan fighters hunted in fluid adaptive groups rather than rigid formations. The way they tested their prey's reactions before committing to a kill. The way they became more aggressive when they sensed weakness and more cautious when they encountered resistance. Resistance. That was the key. The Drazan respected resistance the way a predator respected prey that fought back, not with retreat, but with reassessment. He snap-rolled out of the barrel roll and drove straight at the nearest fighter, closing the distance so fast that his own proximity alert screamed amber, then red. The Drazan pilot, if the simulation's AI deserved the title, hesitated for a fraction of a second. Not long, but enough. Wyatt put a burst into its forward sensor array at near point-blank range and broke hard right as the fighter went blind. It veered off, crippled, its attack run aborted. Not a kill, but it was out of the fight for the next several seconds, and several seconds against 3 opponents was considerably more manageable than several seconds against 4. 2 active, 1 crippled, 1 dead, 90 seconds in. The 2 remaining fighters regrouped with an efficiency that made his jaw tighten. They came at him in a staggered approach, 1 high and 1 low, offset by just enough distance that he couldn't evade both simultaneously without exposing himself to at least 1 clean firing solution. It was a good tactic. Better than good. It was the kind of adaptive hunting pattern that the black box recordings had shown in the final moments before the footage cut to static. Wyatt did something the recordings never showed, because the pilots in those recordings had never thought to try it. He flew directly into the gap between the 2 fighters, splitting their formation down the middle at full throttle. For 1 second, 1 impossibly long second, he was between them, close enough to see the simulated detail on both hulls, and neither could fire without risking a hit on the other. He used that second to put a burst into the belly of the upper fighter as he passed beneath it. The shot wasn't clean. It struck the aft shielding rather than the hull, but it forced the fighter into a defensive break that separated it from its wingman. Now they were alone. 1-on-1. Twice. He took the lower fighter first. It had committed to a turn that would bring it back onto his tail, but the turn was wide. Too wide, by perhaps 3 degrees, a margin that would have been invisible to any pilot who hadn't spent a year measuring the gap between doctrine and reality in fractions. Wyatt cut inside the turn, matched the fighter's arc for 2 seconds, and fired twice. Both bursts connected. The contact went red. 2 down, 1 crippled, 1 remaining. 2 minutes and 12 seconds. The last active Drazan fighter didn't run. It came at him head-on. Weapons blazing, the simulation's AI committing everything to a final aggressive pass that was either desperation or the digital equivalent of spite. Wyatt met it. He flew straight into the oncoming fire, juking laterally in micro-corrections that threaded him between the incoming rounds with margins so thin the proximity alerts gave up and went solid red. At 200 meters, he fired. At 150, the Drazan fired back. At 100, both shots connected simultaneously. Wyatt felt his stomach lurch, and his hands trembled for a half-second before he squeezed the controls and forced them still. Not now. Later. I'll fall later. 3 down. 1 crippled. The damaged fighter was still out there, circling at the edge of his sensor range, its movements erratic but not random. It was recalibrating. The blinded sensor array had partially recovered, the simulation allowing for field repairs that real Drazen fighters were known to perform, and it was turning back toward him with the slow, deliberate intent of a wounded predator that hadn't forgotten who had wounded it. Wyatt checked his ammunition. Low. His shields were at 12% and recharging slowly. His maneuvering thrusters were running hot from 2 minutes of flying harder than the simulation's cockpit was designed to sustain. He was battered, depleted, and one clean hit from destruction. But there was only one of them left. He turned to the crippled fighter and accelerated. The Drazen came at him from the port quarter, its approach uneven but committed. Wyatt lined up the shot. The reticle settled over the fighter's damaged hull. His finger found the trigger. The lights went out. Not the simulation lights, the chamber lights. Every display in the cockpit went dark simultaneously, replaced by the harsh, strobing red of an emergency alert. A klaxon split the silence. The Academy's station-wide emergency alarm, the one reserved for hull breaches, reactor failures, and immediate evacuations. The simulation froze, then collapsed, the Drazen fighter and the starfield dissolving into gray static before the displays shut down entirely. All novices vacate simulation chambers immediately. Emergency protocols in effect. This is not a drill! Wyatt sat in the dead cockpit, his hands still on the controls, his reticle still centered on a target that no longer existed. His breathing was elevated. His heart rate, for the first time in as long as he could remember, was above resting. The adrenaline of 2 minutes and 38 seconds against 4 Drazen fighters coursed through his system with nowhere left to go. 2 minutes and 38 seconds. 3 kills. 1 crippled. The last fighter was damaged, alone, and heading straight into his firing solution. Through clenched teeth that made his gums ache, he squeezed the trigger 6 times in sheer impotence. He'd been about to kill the 4th Drazant fighter. Victory was within his grasp. The emergency alarm wailed on, filling the dead cockpit with noise that brought him back to reality. Slowly, Wyatt exhaled through his nose and relaxed his entire body. He unclenched his hands from the controls, 1 finger at a time. He unstrapped. He stood. He put on his mask of calm. He walked out of the simulation chamber. The observation room was controlled chaos. Novices were filing toward the exits as per emergency protocol, their movements brisk but orderly. The overhead display was dark. The simulation feed was gone. A proctor was directing traffic toward the muster point with the weary efficiency of someone who had done this before and didn't find it interesting. Wyatt's eyes found Beaumont Hale. The instructor stood by the proctor's station, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression a convincing mask of concern that an emergency warranted. He was speaking to a junior technician, his voice too low to carry across the room, his body language conveying nothing more than the diligent attention of an officer responding to a crisis. But his shoulders were wrong. There was no tension in them. The rigid set that Wyatt had learned to read as clearly as a sensor display was gone, replaced by something looser. Something that looked, to anyone who had spent a year cataloging this man's every tell, very much like relief. There would be no record. The simulation had been terminated by emergency protocol not completed. The score, 3 kills against a Drazan patrol squadron in under 3 minutes by a second-year commoner novice pilot, would be logged as incomplete. Interrupted. Void. Likely erased. The system had been saved by a fire alarm that, Wyatt was quietly and completely certain, had nothing to do with fire. He couldn't prove it. He would never be able to prove it. And Beaumont Hale knew that, which was why the instructor's shoulders had relaxed, and why his mask of concern sat so comfortably on a face that had been wearing masks of its own for far longer than Wyatt had been alive. Wyatt walked past him toward the exit. He did not make eye contact. He did not slow down. His expression was the same blank compliance it always was, but in the ledger, the entry was already being written. Not with bitterness, with the cold, patient precision of a boy who understood that the Academy's weapons were not fists or lashes. They were alarms and paperwork, and the quiet, administrative machinery of men who could not compete, and so chose instead to ensure the competition never reached its conclusion. 2 minutes and 38 seconds. 3 confirmed kills. 1 crippled fighter limping into his sights, about to die. A victory denied. Everyone in that observation room knew what was about to happen, and no amount of emergency protocol would make them forget it. It's enough. That small victory shall suffice, Wyatt thought, Bever looking back. The alarm resolved in under 10 minutes. No hull breach, no reactor fault, no environmental contamination. The official explanation, when it came, was a sensor malfunction in the environmental monitoring grid, a faulty carbon dioxide reader in a maintenance shaft 3 sections away from the simulation chambers that had triggered a station-wide alert through what the technical report would later describe as an automated cascade response. Nobody believed it. Nobody said so. Wyatt walked back toward the dormitory wing through corridors that were still clearing from the evacuation. Novices moved in loose groups, the emergency's brief disruption to the schedule creating the kind of unstructured time that the Academy's rigid timetable rarely permitted. The nobles used it to cluster and gossip. The commoners used it to be somewhere else. He could feel the attention. Not directed at him openly, no one was foolish enough to stare at a commoner in a corridor full of nobles, but present nonetheless. Glances that lasted a fraction too long. Conversations that dipped in volume as he passed. The particular quality of awareness that settled over a group of people who all knew something had happened and were still deciding what it meant. Let them decide. The simulation was logged as incomplete. The score didn't exist. It's already been filed. Just another entry in the long catalog of blue blood cowardice. Move on, thought the brown-eyed young man. He was passing by the Marine training wing when he heard it. A short, sharp sound, impact, followed by the clatter of a body hitting a mat, followed by silence. Then another impact, then another. The rhythm was fast, almost musical, each strike landing with a precision that suggested the person doing the striking was not so much fighting as conducting. The training room had an observation viewport, and Wyatt slowed without consciously deciding to. Inside, 6 Marine trainees stood in a loose semicircle around a single figure. Or rather, 5 stood. The 6th was on the mat, blinking at the ceiling with the particular expression of someone trying to reconstruct the sequence of events that had put him there. The single figure at the center was a Royal Marine, not a trainee, not an instructor, but something far greater. A real Royal Marine visiting or stationed, Wyatt couldn't tell, but the difference between this man and the trainees surrounding him was the same difference between Beaumont Hale and a lone wolf. The trainees wore the look of people who had been taught a system. The Royal Marine wore the look of someone who had broken systems for a living and found the work agreeable. One of the trainees moved. A committed lunge, textbook form, the kind of attack that looked impressive in a training manual. The Royal Marine shifted barely, a movement so economical it almost wasn't there, and the trainee was on the mat. 2 more came from opposite sides. The Royal Marine took the first one apart with a strike that redirected momentum rather than met it, then used the stumbling body as a barrier against the second, before dropping them both with 2 short, precise movements that Wyatt's untrained eye couldn't fully track but his pilot's instincts could appreciate. Under 30 seconds, 6 trainees. The Royal Marine hadn't broken a sweat. He stood at the center of the mat, surrounded by groaning bodies, and adjusted the cuff of his sleeve as though he'd done nothing more strenuous than open a door. Wyatt wondered briefly, and with no small amount of satisfaction, what would happen if that man ever met Beaumont Hale in a corridor. The thought sustained him more than breakfast had. Wyatt watched for 3 seconds longer than he should have. It wasn't his discipline. He would never fight like that, would never need to. But he recognized the principle beneath the craft, the gap between what institutions taught and what actually worked when the rules stopped mattering. The Royal Marine hadn't fought the way the trainees had been trained to fight. He had fought the way that ended fights. Different skill. Same truth. He moved on. By evening, the year group knew. The commoners passed the information the way commoners always passed information, in fragments, in hushed whispers, in the particular way one person looked at another across the mess hall without speaking. 3 Drazen kills. A crippled 4th, under 3 minutes. Emergency alarm. Simulation voided. The details varied depending on who was telling them. The Corps didn't. The nobles knew too, though their version carried a different inflection. Whispered with the uncomfortable edge of people confronted by something the hierarchy wasn't designed to accommodate. A commoner had done something remarkable in a simulation that was designed to be impossible, and the only reason it wasn't on the record was that someone had pulled an alarm. The implications sat in the air like a held breath, and every noble who breathed it in chose, wisely, to exhale in a direction that didn't point at Beaumont Hale. Wyatt sat on his bunk in the commoner dormitory, his back against the wall, staring at nothing in particular. The adrenaline had long since faded, replaced by the familiar, low-grade exhaustion that followed any engagement, simulated or otherwise, where his body had operated at peak capacity and was now presenting the bill. His muscles ached. His hands, which had gripped the flight controls with the desperate precision of a pilot fighting 4-to-1 odds, were sore in the joints. The dormitory was quiet. Most of the other commoner novices had drifted to the mess hall or the common areas, leaving the bunk room empty save for Wyatt and the ever-present hum of the ventilation system. He preferred it this way. Silence was a resource, and the academy provided very little of it. Then the door opened. Petra Dainton stood in the doorway. She didn't enter immediately. She stood there for a moment, reading the room the way she read everything, quietly, carefully. "Staples," she said. Not a greeting. An announcement of intent. "Dainton," Wyatt replied, his tone neutral. He didn't look up. She entered and sat on the bunk opposite his. The gap between them was regulation width, barely a meter, but she didn't lean forward or try to close it. She sat with her hands on her knees, her posture straight, her expression carrying something that Wyatt recognized but hadn't seen directed at him in a long time. Not pity, not admiration. Just the steady, unadorned honesty of one person acknowledging another. "I'm not here to congratulate you," she said. "That would be stupid." "It would," Wyatt agreed. "I'm here because I watched what happened in that observation room, and I watched what happened when the alarm went off, and I watched Beaumont Hale's face afterwards. And I think you could use someone to talk to who doesn't wear a crest on their chest." Wyatt said nothing for a moment. He looked at her properly for the first time. Petra Dainton. The quiet girl who flew competently but never well enough to draw attention. The commoner who had perfected the art of being present without being noticed. Smart. He had always thought so. He still did. "I appreciate the thought, Dainton," he said. His voice was even, measured, carrying the same practiced tone he used with instructors and nobles and every other person in this academy who existed on the other side of the wall he had built. "But I don't need someone to talk to." Petra studied him. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She held his gaze with the same quiet steadiness that made her a competent pilot and a better survivor, and for a moment, Wyatt felt the walls shift. Not crack, not weaken, just shift, the way a bulkhead shifts when pressure is applied from an unexpected angle. "I didn't say you needed it," she said. "I said you could use it." "There's a difference." He shrugged. "Not in here, there isn't." The words came out flat. Not cold, not hostile. Just closed and empty. The sound of a door shutting with the precise, unhurried finality of someone who had decided long ago that doors were safer shut. Petra looked at him for a long moment. Whatever she was searching for, she didn't find it, or perhaps she found exactly what she expected and had simply needed to confirm it for herself. She nodded once, stood, and walked to the door. She paused in the doorway. "You know, Staples, surviving this place and surviving it alone aren't the same thing." Then she was gone. The door closed behind her. The dormitory was silent again. Wyatt sat on his bunk and stared at the wall. The ventilation hummed. The metal plating was scratched and dull, marked by the restless hands of every commoner who had lain there before him. He frowned and let out an almost condescending chuckle. She was wrong. Surviving this place and surviving it alone were exactly the same thing. Connections could be leveraged. Friendships were pressure points. Every person you cared about was a weapon the Academy could use against you, and the Academy used every weapon it had. He had learned that lesson in his first month, when a commoner novice 2 bunks down had made the mistake of befriending a noble's servant and found his locker emptied, his uniform shredded, and a misconduct report on his record before the week was out. Wyatt didn't make mistakes like that. He didn't make friends. He didn't need them. He had a cockpit and a ledger and the cold, precise certainty that one day he would be in a place where none of this mattered. That was enough. It had to be. He lay back on his bunk and stared at the ceiling. The scratched metal stared back, indifferent, offering nothing. Somewhere in the administrative systems of this academy, a simulation score was being logged as incomplete, and an alarm was being filed as a sensor malfunction, and the machinery of the institution was quietly, efficiently erasing the evidence that a 15-year-old commoner had done something extraordinary. But 112 novices had been in that observation room, and not one of them would forget what they saw on that display before the lights went out. Wyatt closed his eyes. The dreams, when they came, were not of Drazen or alarms or closed doors. They were of stars. They were always of stars.